My name is Roy Hudson, and I appreciate the chance to speak here today on fabulous fables and Britain's oldest straight track. I read some fabulous fables, and I looked for lays that would make sense if the fables were true. And I found three. The first lay vindicates the fable. The second lay might be Britain's oldest straight track, and the third lay supports the first two. And that's what I'll go through today. Bill Cooper was a scholar and author, and he studied the old genealogies of British and European kings, among other things, who traced their ancestry back to Noah. And Bill Cooper's book, After the Flood, it described British history as beginning with Brutus of Troy. And that just got me wondering, could that be true? So I'll start with the fables. Ancient Troy was in the northwest of what is now Turkey, and the fables say that a century after Troy fell to the Greeks, Brutus of Troy was the first to settle Britain, giving his name to the island and to the Britons who dwell here. He's often called Brutus of Troy to separate him from the much later Roman Brutus, the contemporary of Julius Caesar. Now, Brutus is a Latinized version of his name. His name base is something like Brut or Brit, and the ending is the masculine singular nominative. And different forms of his name have been used, and the pronunciation implied in these Welsh and Irish sources matches well with our word Briton. And I'm using the word Brutus just because it's the version Brutus because it's the most common today. The tales of Brutus settling Britain are found in texts some scholars attribute to the 7th century St. Tysilio, the 9th century Nennius, and in others like the controversial Geoffrey of Monmouth of the 12th century. Other notable people down the years have also endorsed Brutus as actual history, such as John Dee, who wrote, "If God will, at another apter time and in more apt place, marvelous agreement of the histories of antiquity and great unlooked-for light and credit will be restored to the originals of Brutus." So what exactly are these originals of Brutus? What are these fabulous fables? Cooper's translation of the Tysilio Chronicle is a great place to start. I'll set the scene, I'll summarize what the Chronicles tell us about Brutus, and then I'll mention a few other legends that relate to him. So the fables begin 32 centuries ago, in the age of Homer's heroes and gods, Greek and Trojan armies clashing on the plains of Troy. Troy fell, Troy burned. The Trojans who survived were taken to Greece as slaves. But the Trojan prince Aeneas had escaped the city with his father, his young son, and a group of followers. They made their way in ships to Italy, where the royal Aeneas was welcomed with honor. He married the daughter of a king, and later gained that king's throne. Aeneas prospered. Brutus was the great-grandson of Aeneas and heir to that throne. Before his birth, the wise men declared that Brutus would cause the death of his father and mother, but after exile and wandering, he would achieve great honor. His mother died giving birth to him, and when he was 15 and hunting with his father, Brutus shot an arrow at a stag, but accidentally killed his father, and the people of Italy banished him. In his exile, he went to Greece and saw Trojans, his own people, living in slavery. He stayed with them, and they found him wise and noble and generous. Trojans all over Greece asked him to be prince over them and deliver them from their captivity. And he did. With courage and skill, he led a tiny army against the king of Greece and won the Trojans' freedom. Brutus captured the king, and for his ransom, he demanded ships, supplies, and the king's daughter Imogen as his wife. 324 ships were collected together for the Trojan men, women, and children, and loaded with provisions. They sailed first to an island called Leucadia, off the coast of Greece, which was then in ruins. At a temple, they found a statue of Diana, and Brutus resolved to make a sacrifice there and seek her guidance on what land they should settle in. Brutus placed on his head a laurel of vine leaves, and in accordance with the ancient customs, sacrifice was made to Jupiter, Mercury, and Diana. Brutus addressed the statue of Diana, saying, "O thou who art the mighty queen of the hunt, protectress of the forest boar, O thou to whom it is given to ride the vault of heaven and the halls of hell, tell me which land I shall possess to dwell in, where I may worship thee through the ages and the years, and I shall build in that place a house in which to worship thee." He finished the ritual and he lay down to sleep in front of the altar. And he dreamed that he saw Diana before him, saying, "Brutus, beneath the setting of the sun, beyond the land of Gaul, there lies an island in the sea in which giants once lived. It is empty now. Go there, for it is set aside for you and your descendants, and it shall be for your children like a second Troy, and kings shall be born of your line, unto whom the whole earth shall pay homage." Brutus and his people sailed westward along the southern coast of the Mediterranean. They met more Trojans who pledged fealty to Brutus. They landed in Gaul and defeated an army. They sailed beyond Gaul to the island in the west. The chronicles say they first came ashore on the beach at Totnes. The land was known as Albion, and but for a few giants, it was uninhabited. Brutus and his people were delighted with the island, and the giants sought refuge in the mountains. And then, with the consent of the princes, the people divided the land amongst themselves, and they began to plow it and to build houses upon it, and after only a short while, one would have thought that it had been settled for hundreds of years. And Brutus wished to call the land by his own name, and he decreed that the people dwelling therein should be called Britons, also after his own name, for he craved a renown lasting to the end of time. And when Brutus wished to build a city, he traveled the length of the land looking for a suitable place for it. And he came finally to the banks of the Thames and walked along its sands. And when he found a place that met all his desires, he built there a city and named it New Troy. Now, other legends connect the Brutus Stone in Totnes with these fables. An anonymous 14th century English chronicle says that Brut set London stone. Some say it was a mark stone in the center of the city. Others speak of a temple to Diana on the site of St. Paul's Cathedral. And many of the fables say that when Brutus died, he was buried on the White Hill, where the Tower of London now stands. I'll leave the fables there. Let's look at the two stones. Today in Totnes, we only see the top of the Brutus stone. London stone is in an altogether sorrier state. At one time, it seems to have been an obelisk, and we'll get into that later. But what we have today is about the size of an airplane cabin bag. It's normally in this alcove after being moved out of the roadway in 1742, out of what is now Cannon Street. Sometimes it's on loan to a museum. If it's a mark stone, putting it on loan to a museum seems to me like taking a landline phone, unplugging it, putting it in your car, and trying to make a call. But I like mark stones. So what I did is I put Bill Cooper's research on the ancient fables together with Alfred Watkins' criteria for ley hunting. And I drew some lines in Google Earth. These are the three leys we'll talk about. The red Troy to London stone ley, the orange Brutus stone ley, and the yellow two stones ley. Methodology, briefly. Most of the images here are from Google Earth. Other sources include the National Library of Scotland for their historic Ordnance Survey maps, and the website Layers of London for a fascinating map of medieval London. I can't recommend Layers of London highly enough. I've used the narrowest line for precision, except on some slides to make it clearer. Now, looking down at a church tower here, if that bollard is 10 inches wide, then the line is about 2 inches wide. And near miss is not accepted. This is a near miss. That church is not on this ley. I've matched up other historical maps by manually overlaying them very carefully on top of Google Earth. Some of the websites allow overlay or side-by-side comparison, but they're not always completely accurate. This isn't a survey. I'm not a surveyor. Google Earth isn't a surveying tool. When using Google Earth to match a point in a line, a lot of care has to be taken to center the point. You'll see if you've ever used it. But I will say, I have been very careful not to force any points or lines to go anywhere. I've let them fall where they may, and this is the result of that. And I'll share the latitude and longitude coordinates of all the points I discuss in a handout at the end. So jump to them whenever you like. So I drew a straight line, which Google Earth obviously plots correctly as a geodesic over the curvature of the Earth. I drew a straight line from Troy through the original location of London Stone. Where's the original location of London Stone? A little hard to say. I'll explain later where I found that. Now, 3 sites on this line connect directly to the Brutus legends: the Tower, London Stone, and St. Paul's. And just within London, 2 ancient churches also endorse that ley. Within Troy, I chose the highest tower, the northeast bastion, just on grounds of practicality as a sighting point. But because Troy is so far away and the citadel of the city is really quite small, different points in the city don't make a big difference to the line in Britain. That line came into London, central London, at the Tower of London, right through the White Tower itself. And to me, that was a strong start. Then the line passed directly through 2 pre-Reformation churches. First, St. Dunstan in the east. What's here is the bombed-out remains of a church from 1821, with the tower surviving from Sir Christopher Wren's design after the Great Fire of 1666. There's a very long history of a church on this site. The architect of the 1821 church said that this was probably the most ancient ecclesiastical structure in the east of London. Looking back before 1666, the wonderful Layers of London pre-fire map here raises the possibility that the ley originally went through the point of the spire. We have a larger, chunkier tower than the slim one now. We can see from looking at the line of the building, what's that bit for? It would make sense for the tower to have been twice the width as before, which would put the ley coming right into the center of the tower, or near as I can see. So possibly the ley going directly through the spire. St. George Bottle Lane is next. It's first documented in 1180, first documented, who knows before that. The post-fire Wren Church is bottom left. In this picture, we're looking up George Lane, like that. The church on the map is the Wren one, and the ley is going directly through the tower. The previous church from the pre-fire map is pictured up here with a spire, and again, the possibility of the ley passing directly through the point of the spire. Then beyond to London Stone. We'll talk more about London Stone later, it gets its own little section. Then beyond to St. Paul's Cathedral. The point I've marked on the ley here is what may have been the top of Ludgate Hill. The website topographicmap.com is helpful, although it won't be completely accurate here because there's a big old cathedral on top of the hill. This mapping suggests that this hilltop may have been 15 to 20 feet higher than the ground level at London Stone. This current cathedral replaced Old St. Paul's, which burned down in the Great Fire. Old St. Paul's here from Layers of London, again with the blue dot showing the possible top of the hill. What I think is really interesting on this one is St. Augustine's Gate here. In the original Temple of Diana, which I believe stood on this site, it would have made perfect sense to have the main gate on the ley towards London Stone, which I believe would have been the center of the city. So the gate itself is arguably another point on the ley. It's plausible to think that a major temple stood on this site before the founding of St. Paul's in AD 604. Just 3 years before that, Pope Gregory had written a message to Augustine of Canterbury saying that pagan temples in Britain ought not to be destroyed, but rather converted to the service of the true God. He didn't mean that as advice. He said if the temples were well built, it was requisite that they be converted. Considering Pope Gregory's command, it would be logical for the largest Christian site in London to have been converted from the largest pagan site. And that speaks in support of the other two other churches as well, and in fact, churches all over Britain that share this same ancient lineage. Outside of London, there's more sites on the Ley, and I'll just mention one, my salute to Alfred Watkins in Herefordshire. Right on the top of what's now known as Millennium Hill, which is part of which is a secondary hilltop to the Herefordshire Beacon. What I wonder is if the lower Millennium Hill might have been built up artificially to some extent to connect the overall site with the Ley. If so, that would affirm the accuracy of the Ley, because it really smacks that hill on the hilltop, but that is just a supposition. Now, so the London Stone Ley is at its heart a classic Watkins-style city ley, but that also carries on 1,500 miles to the very center of ancient Troy. After that encouragement, I tried a line from Troy to Totnes, to the Brutus Stone there. And the name Totnes, from Watkins' point of view, is very encouraging. That suggests that with the Trojans could have come Watkins's dogmen and establishing Totnes, perhaps even as a datum for the whole country, I don't know. The idea of who were the dogmen, initially maybe, let's recall our word govern is from the ancient Greek, and it's directly from the ancient Greek, meaning to pilot a ship. The master mariner charts the paths, navigates, and steers the ship, and that was governing. We heard how, until the age of 15, Brutus was raised as a king, and raised as heir to a throne. And if charting the paths was part of a king's work of governing, then I'd expect Brutus to have learned that. We've heard that in the Old English Chronicle that Brut set London stone. And there's reasons to think this could be possible. Memorializing history is a very powerful tool to reinforce a king's authority, and a good transportation network brings prosperity to a nation. Now, in Totnes, there's this simple but tantalizing line from the Brutus Stone right down the center of the ancient Fore Street to a ford, perhaps Brutus's landing place, on the River Dart, and then directly on to Troy. This 1877 map shows a sighting line directly down the north side of the street. Is the marking here ancient way something of an understatement? The Brutus Stone Ley could just be, and I'm calling the core of the ley really from the stone to the ford, anchored to Troy. This Brutus Stone Ley could just be Britain's oldest straight track if the Brutus Stone could be validated as a mark stone. Well, if the Brutus Stone and the London Stone are both legitimate, there should be a ley between them, or it would be logical if there were. So, what's here? There are indeed some significant points on this line. Starting out from the Brutus Stone in Totnes and looking southwest, we have the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Dipford, the pre-Reformation church, long before pre-Reformation. The tower is at the west end. So again, a possibility of the ley going directly through the spire. Back up to Totnes and heading towards London Stone, we meet this fella, the Sword Giant, who really needs no introduction. Another point on the line is an ancient settlement at Ringmoor near Turnworth in Dorset. I don't know anything about this site other than what is at the excellent megalithic.co.uk, but I mention it in case somebody else does. And my favorite, there's a spectacular crossroads at Sunbury Cross. There's no cross in this Ordnance Survey 6-inch map from about 1875 or any other maps I've seen, but I've proposed a logical place for an original mark stone or cross. That place, directly on the lake, allows sighting in every direction, which seems the core of the practicality. I'm very grateful for these wonderful National Library of Scotland maps. It was very hard to do anything with this. When I was overlaying these maps, there's a white line there that I got to know really well as I was overlaying these maps. If I ever drive down the M3, I'll wave at my old friend there. Okay, St. Paul's. Aerial view here. We've just come up now. The yellow 2 stones lay to London Stone. And now we're looking from St. Paul's towards Troy. So we've seen the extraordinary precision of this alignment in London. It's locking together 3 sites at the heart of the Brutus legends with the very citadel of ancient Troy, the absolute starting point of these fables. I don't see how this alignment could be random. If that's random, then the M6 is a naturally occurring rock formation. Maybe that's a similar order of magnitude, I don't know. I don't see another plausible explanation other than this being actual history written on the earth by Brutus himself as an ageless memorial. We'll come back to this after we've talked more about London Stone, but what about Totnes and perhaps Britain's oldest straight track? So the 2 stones lay has endorsed the Brutus stone as a serious markstone. In that case, that Brutus stone lay from Totnes back to Troy could be the first of Britain's old straight tracks. To me, its simplicity is a hallmark of the primeval. It doesn't need anything more. The markstone, the straight street, the landing place, the ancient city. A monument to the beginning of Britain that still tells its story today. Imagine, even to this very day, Britons can stand at the stone, today on the stone, sight down the north side of the street through that very riverside, knowing that they are sighting Troy itself. As I see it, this is Britain's oldest straight track. Now, how did Brutus become a fable in the first place? There's a lot to that, but I'll pick out 3 points. And after that, we'll look in detail at London Stone, and I'll tie it all together at the end. So the first point for how Brutus became a fable, here on a inscription from the 1500s, I think it happened in these 3 steps. First, New Troy. After 1,000 years of New Troy, the presumptuous King Lud renamed New Troy after himself. He became king in 73 BC. He died a few years before Julius Caesar's invasion of 55 BC. I will only say that if New Troy, if London was still called New Troy, it would be a lot harder to call the Brutus story a fable. Sadly, that's not the case. The next one happened on January the 30th, 1649. January the 30th, 1649. At that time, Brutus was still, by and large, accepted history. The Elizabethan historian John Stowe wrote his Chronicles of England from Brute unto this present year of Christ, 1580, with Brutus firmly historical. And after Elizabeth, James I and Charles I made a lot of use of their descent from Brutus to shore up the new House of Stuart. The course of history changed, January 30th, 1649, a very cold day in the midst of the English Civil War. On that day, the parliamentarians beheaded King Charles I. A pamphlet was published to justify killing him. Its author was the poet John Milton. Killing the king made 1649 the year zero of the revolutionary regime, and with the new regime, a new and politically correct history of the nation was needed. Milton immediately got writing. Charles I had been the heir of Brutus on the throne of Brutus. Milton needed a different starting point for his new British history, and he wrote what has become the standard line to this day. This we find, he writes, that of British affairs, from the first peopling of the islands to the coming of Julius Caesar, nothing certain, either by tradition, history, or ancient fame, hath hitherto been left us. So British history began in 55 BC. There was nothing before. Milton goes on to basically say, the smart people agree with me, without backing it up, when he writes, that which we have of oldest seeming hath by the greater part of judicious antiquaries been long rejected for a modern fable. After that debunking, he still included the fable in his History of Britain. He might have thought that it would be too obviously revolutionary propaganda if he didn't include what most people would expect to see. He admits that some qualified antiquarians do accept Brutus as historical, and Milton concedes there may be some truth in the old tales, but he says he's including them, be it for nothing else, but in favor of our English poets and rhetoricians, who by their art will know how to use them judiciously. So he's saying the fables can dress up poetry, they can dress up speeches. Milton was consigning Brutus to mythology. One more point on Milton's history. His party believed they had ended the throne of Brutus forever. So when Milton wrote in his history how Diana had promised to Brutus's line the homage of the whole world, Milton put in a snarky editorial comment. In this, Diana overshot her oracle. But 11 years later, the parliamentarian regime collapsed, and Charles I's son, Charles II, was on the restored throne, and 200 years after that, the sun never set on the British Empire, the industrial superpower, the sole industrial superpower of the world. So Milton, the propagandist of regicide, had to discredit the history of Brutus, and Milton's tremendous reputation after his death made that discrediting stick. And the third step was when Troy and the Trojan War became fables. That was in the mid-19th century when history became a science. A science has laws, a science demands evidence. George Grote was one of Victorian England's greatest historians, and he wrote, "The law respecting sufficiency of evidence ought to be the same for ancient times as for modern." So if we don't have a copy of the Times of Troy, then maybe it's harder to source it. I'm exaggerating. But based on that law, Grote declared all history, all Greek history before the first Olympics, to be legend. The earlier Trojan War, Grote said, was an interesting fable. Troy belonged to mythology. Regarding mythology, Grote said, two courses and two only are open to the historian. Either to pass over the myths altogether, which is the way in which modern historians treat the old British fables, or else to give an account of them as myths, to recognize and respect their specific nature, and to abstain from confounding them with ordinary and certifiable history. And Grote's 12-volume History of Greece became the standard work on the subject. Grote freely admitted people might say he's striking 1,000 years off the scroll of Greek history. He said, that's a good thing. Other historians say I should have struck off even more. In those days, to be a scientific historian was a proud calling, and a lot of pride was taken in the fruits of these new scientific methods, which in a lot of ways was a new and a bold ignorance. We lost so much. And this runaway dismissal of history, it led to some major errors. A little while later, 1871, the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann discovered the actual ruins of legendary Troy. And the reputable website, archaeology.org, says what those ruins have since revealed to us. It says, between 1220 BC and 1180 BC, the city was violently destroyed by war. There is evidence of widespread burning, and in some places up to 3 feet of blackened debris covers the site. There are even unburied human remains strewn around the site. All signs point to a violent end at the hands of an attacking group of outsiders. Grote died in 1871 and was given the honor of burial in Westminster Abbey before Schliemann's findings were published in 1874. Speaking of 19th century science, I'll mention in passing here the three-age system. How could Brutus have been the first to settle Britain when Troy was Bronze Age and Britain is full of Stone Age artifacts? And what I'll say to that is that the three-age system of stone, bronze, and iron, in its simplest form, is one of many artifacts of 19th century science that are no longer taken seriously by the scientific community in anything like the way a lot of us were taught them. It's understood that the use of stone tools lasted for a long, long time. Flint, for example, has advantages. It's cheap, it's naturally sharp, and to a user of a flint tool who knows what they're doing, it's what we might call hackable. You can get just the shape and edge that you want for the job that you're doing. So new doesn't always displace old. I think of the humble wooden spoon, which is still going strong in the age of plastic. Back to history as a science. Indulge me for a moment with my take on an old joke. Apologies in advance. So, three scientists, an astronomer, a physicist, and a mathematician, are on a train, slowly winding their way through the Highlands. And out the window, they see clearly on a hillside one solitary black sheep. And the astronomer says, "Wow, all the sheep in Scotland are black." And the physicist, he says, no, some sheep in Scotland are black. And the mathematician says, well, in Scotland, there exists at least one hillside on which there exists at least one sheep, at least one side of which is black. And the three of them, they have a good laugh together about this, about sufficiency of evidence in their fields of study. Now later on in the hotel bar, the three of them meet a historian, and they found this a lot of fun, and so they tell the historian what had happened. The historian says, to be a historian is to practice a science and to test all evidence rigorously. Your accounts of this purported black sheep are unreliable. Memory is reconstructive and highly malleable. It is by no means a literal recording of events. You were not capable of observing your surroundings accurately. Trains travel far too fast. The likelihood of there being a black sheep is negligible. Your ideological predispositions, your cultural biases have caused you to misremember and misinterpret anything you may have seen. Your black sheep makes for an interesting fable, but history must be told as it really happened. And the three scientists thank him for his observations and head for the pool table. Now, London Stone. It's in the middle of New Troy, east-west, but also, I believe, north-south. It seems reasonable that New Troy didn't extend as far back from the Thames. Perhaps we have a trace of a natural dividing line. It didn't extend as far back from the Thames as the later Roman and medieval city walls, as shown here in about 1300. Talking about London Stone, strangely enough, we need to look at it from the bottom up. After the 1666 fire, the clearance and rebuilding of London gave a chance for some archaeology. Sir Christopher Wren, for example, found Roman pavements under buildings near to the stone, and those Roman pavements were roughly 12 feet under the street level of Wren's time. John Clark is a retired curator of the Museum of London. His 2026 paper, London Stone, History and Myth, brings together a whole lot of information about the stone. And Clark shares many eyewitness notes from Wren's contemporaries, including John Aubrey, who Tamsin mentioned, about the post-fire excavations. And I'll give 4 of those. It seems to have been an obelisk. And these are authoritative observers, people like Robert Hooke, one of the very founders of the Royal Society. The root was broad and went a great way under the houses. It was 10 feet deeper than the Roman level. And after the excavations, after the investigations, the stone remains still, but now scarce peeps his head above ground. Putting all that together in just an imagining, one can imagine London Stone looking more like this. An obelisk, by definition, has a pointed top. It's reasonable to believe it was originally over 20 feet high, with at least 3 feet above the ground level before the fire, going down approximately 12 feet to the Roman level, and another 10 feet to its base. John Clark refers to it as the incredible shrinking monolith. One thought occurs here. We saw that Ludgate Hill, the top of the hill, was perhaps 15 to 20 feet higher than the ground here. And thinking about the relative heights, perhaps a sight line from the temple on the hill could put the peak of the obelisk directly intersecting with the horizon to give a very precise sighting point. What was left of the stone above the ground before the fire was about this size here, about 3 feet high, 2 feet wide, and 1 foot deep. And I believe that may have been off-center to make way for some public works for the central channel or gutter that was laid down the middle of the street. And if that's the case, that wouldn't be the last time the stone had a problem with public works. Less than 100 years after that, this last remaining part was broken off and moved out of the roadway. So what we need for the ley is the original center of the stone, the point that that obelisk marked. And I believe we have that on an Ordnance Survey map of 1875. The cross will indicate a precise location. I would expect that to be the center. But how would the map makers know? I haven't seen the stone in the roadway on an OS map before 1875. In 1863, the Metropolitan Railway surveyed Cannon Street for their proposed new underground line. They would be taking a very particular interest in what was below the ground. It's entirely possible that detailed information about that huge stone under the street was shared as an historical curiosity with the map makers of the Ordnance Survey. Construction of the railway was postponed due to financial troubles, so the stone was still there in 1875 when this map was published. But then public works, once again. Construction of the railway started in the early 1880s. Clark mentions that the full width of Cannon Street was dug out over 30 feet deep for the new underground line, with the street reinstated above it on vaulting or bridge work. So the obelisk is gone, and I don't see it marked on later Ordnance Survey maps. How do we get from this 1875 map to Google Earth? Let's follow St. Swithin's Church and the pavement line in front, incidentally with the previous alcove of London stone. St. Swithin's was mostly destroyed in the Blitz, but the frontage was still there in the early 1960s. Note the bank building appears to share the same building line along the pavement. Today, the bank building is still there, and seeing it in this Google Maps picture, we can confirm that the building line is still the same for the bank and for St. Swithin's. Then that lets us bring the 1875 map back in, and the arrow marks the center of London stone on that map. So if we keep the arrow but take away the 1875 map, then we can see today the center of London stone. This is Google Maps because it gives this imagery clearer. I put it into Google Earth by, again, I'm not a surveyor, but I zoomed right in and measured very carefully against the street markings to the 1/10 of a millimeter on some calipers held up to the screen. Again, I'm not a surveyor, but as I said before, it's not a survey, but I've done this very carefully, and I've done it objectively. I didn't say, ooh, I want it a little further north, I want it a little further south. That's where, to the best of my abilities and the best of my methods, that fell. So we have London stone in Google Earth now, and that then, together with ancient Troy, gives us the London stone ley. So pulling this all together, we've heard how Brutus craved a renown lasting to the end of time. That was in the Chronicle. I believe Brutus resolved that the true beginning of Britain must never be forgotten. And so he wrote this history on the earth as a timeless memorial. I believe that on the hill in the west of his new city, he fulfilled his vow to Diana to build her a temple in which he would worship her. And as a flight of fancy, as I imagine it, maybe he reasoned, this temple will be as eternal as the goddess. The ancient hill of Troy will be as eternal as the earth. Let a great obelisk of stone be raised in the center of New Troy. Let its peak be aligned truly between this temple and the hill of Troy, true to the width of a man's eye. For all time, Britons may stand at the high temple and look over New Troy to the stone's peak and beyond to Troy, and so forever Britons may lift their face to their ancient home and remember the ancient city. The great obelisk was placed with the utmost calculation and care, and Brutus ruled, and he died, and I believe he had commanded that he be buried at the eastern edge of his city, where he would keep watch, and he would be buried precisely upon that line to Troy, forever uniting him, his Diana, his new land, and his ancient home. In later ages, very little remained, but it was enough. Time buried the great obelisk, which slept in mystery as London stone until it was pulled from the earth. Even then, Britons, respectful of history, marked where it had stood. The western hilltop still resounded with worship, and in the east, Brutus's grave remained, silently honored and protected. For 3,000 years, fortress after fortress had stood guard over it. Today, the shining white fortress called the Tower of London. So, to conclude, in this late age, what of the renown of Brutus? Does it survive? What is renown? Renown is the repetition of a name. Brit. How many million times every day is his name repeated in Britain, by Britons, and across the world? I do not know the reason why, but Brutus is being granted his renown. Thank you. And these coordinates are on a handout here. One other thing I'll mention, I'm so fond of Dr. Cooper's book, After the Flood. There's 8 copies here. I would really invite everybody to help themselves, completely gratis. It's just a little slim book. If you have any interest in reading more about this, it's a great place to start. So, thank you.
And this is online?
I will put this on YouTube. Yeah. So, if there's any questions, I'll do my best to answer, or if you want to just roll on, that's good too. So.
Well, what year do you think Brutus come to Britain?
About roughly 1100 BC, roughly. Different people have different estimates on that, but in the ballpark of that. And then died, apparently he reigned here 24 years, if I recall.
Right. And do you know the line that you've got from Troy to the London Stone and Totnes? But is that a line that is known as a ley line, or is it been tested that it is a ley line? Have they been out to?
To my knowledge, I haven't seen any mention anywhere of this line being before, having been noticed before, or having been noticed for however many thousands of years or centuries or whatever it is. I think this is fairly newly coming to light.
Have you researched beyond where the lines, in the directions that the lines are going?
I've looked a little bit. On the handout, I give the endpoints in Britain of the line.
Yeah.
Because this is focusing on Britain, I haven't extended the lines further past the boundaries of the island. There's so much here. I feel a little bit like, I've been looking at this for just a few months, and I feel a little bit like when an armored van full of money turns over on the motorway and there's 50-pound notes flying everywhere, and then you run around trying to grab all the 50-pound notes. That's the situation I'm in as I'm looking at the kind of riches that this combination of Cooper's history and Watkins' criteria is revealing. So there's a lot more to find out there.
Yeah. Because the line that you put in from Troy to London, it looks like it clips Wales, Ireland. So yeah, you might find a lot more interesting sites.
It goes just to the north of Aberystwyth, for example, and yeah, I don't know Wales well, and I completely lack the ability to understand the etymology of Welsh place names, for example, which I think that would be a very interesting way into it, among many, many other interesting ways into it.
Do you think the name London has any relationship? You mentioned Totnes with the Watkinsian connection.
To the city name London?
To the city name London, yeah. Is that just a change of name? Or
it appears to
you feel that's a change of name?
London appears to be a derivation, or a corruption, perhaps a derivation from Caer Lundine, or Caer Lud as it was named originally. Caer Lud to Caer Lundine to London is what I've read as how we got the name London.
And looking through Europe, how do you think the alignment goes through Europe, or is that yet to be done?
The alignment going through Europe, I've had really a cursory look, because to me, other than a couple of sites in France related to the Brutus legend, it doesn't seem like there's anything there that Brutus would be memorializing.
Well, what about the departure point from the London to on the coast?
Again, it's just north, I believe, of Dover, through the White Cliffs, which some say is the reason the island was called the White Island or Albion. I haven't seen anything there, although the line does pass through a little ways inland from the coast. It passes through an ancient stone axe factory, or very near to an ancient stone axe factory. Perhaps there was some settlement there as well. But again, it's one of these things where there's 50-pound notes flying all through the air, and I haven't been able to grab them all.
I think this is brilliant. I mean, it's opened up so much. I mean, you're opening a huge book, and like you say, you're throwing those 50-pound notes out yourself.
Yeah. There's so many possible lines of inquiry here. If I draw a line from ancient Troy southward to the harbor of Rhodes, to the point where the legends say the Colossus of Rhodes would have stood, then that line goes through the ancient city of Smyrna. And so, because I'm thinking, is it possible that within at least ancient Western Anatolia, the Turkish peninsula, that this use of straight lines was already, it would make sense for that to have been a normal practice in ancient Western Anatolia. The only 50-pound note I've been able to grab from the air is that, I've had time to grab from the air, is that line from Troy through Smyrna to the harbor of Rhodes. Smyrna is in two sites. That's arguably a later site from Roman times, or sorry, Alexander's time, I believe. But I'm not sure there wouldn't have been something there before. Anyway, you get an idea of the riches that are out there here that are just kind of being, that this is a key that seems to unlock a lot of stuff.
And the angles of the lines? You've got a big triangle there. Is
Yeah,
significant do you think about the angles?
I have not gotten into that. So yeah, I don't know if you multiply that angle out, I don't know with what figures you end up, and that's an area of the study of lays that I'm less familiar with, the significance of various angles. So.
Anybody?
Would you, I think it would be a good idea to extend the line out into the countryside, maybe, because I think it goes through Shropshire, doesn't it?
It goes just a bit south of Shropshire, I believe.
Is it?
Yeah.
But yeah, and then maybe get a group to go out and do some dowsing along your.
That's one of many possible approaches to teasing out the possible significance of this. I agree with that. Yeah. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.